What if I told you that one ordinary phone call could turn your entire life into a museum of memories overnight? What if the silence in your house wasn't empty, but full of unfinished conversations, invisible presence, and emotional weight you never asked for? Tonight's story isn't just about loss. It's about impact, about fragile reality, about facing death straight and honored when you never thought you'd have to. It's about one last drink that was never meant to be the last, and the moment when absence becomes louder than any scream. It's about the kind of grief that doesn't shout, but slowly rearranges your blood, your breathing, your way of seeing eternity. And somewhere inside this story, maybe you'll recognize your own echo, the conversations you haven't finished yet. So stay with me, because by the end of this, silence might mean something completely different to you. In the next few minutes, you'll walk through an empty house that holds no ghosts, only memory. You'll witness the exact second when impact arrived without warning. You'll sit at a kitchen table where one last drink becomes a bridge between goodbye and legacy. You'll feel the inner war between denial and acceptance. You'll understand how deep silence can either destroy you or rebuild you. And you might start asking yourself a dangerous but necessary question. What would your museum of memories look like if it ended today? Because this isn't just his story, it might be yours. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever whispered something too late, if you've ever stared at a dusty frame and felt your chest tighten, then this story was meant to find you. Stay until the end, because the transformation doesn't happen where you expect it. And if stories like this move you, if they make you reflect, breathe, and feel deeper than usual, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we tell stories in a way you've never experienced before. He always told himself this empty house has no ghosts, just memory, but tonight the silence feels like a living thing that sits beside him and doesn't blink. The dim light from the hallway lamp spills across the cold walls, and every shadow looks like an echo of a life that used to be loud without even trying. He inhales slow breathing through a heavy chest, and fragile reality wobbles again like a loose floorboard that squeaks only when you're alone. It's the final night kind of quiet, the deep silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat as if it's knocking to be let out. If someone asked him what's wrong, he'd shrug and joke, "It's just an old place," but his trembling hands would tell the truth before his mouth could. Because absence isn't empty, not really, it's an invisible presence that rearranges the air until the room feels smaller than it was yesterday. And right there, in that tight air, he realizes he doesn't want to wake up from the great dream where goodbye didn't exist yet. In the living room, dusty frames line the shelves like soldiers standing at attention, and he calls it his museum of memories with a grin that doesn't reach his eyes. There are so many photos that the walls look like a private gallery, but the trophies are few, because the real legacy isn't metal, it's faces. He traces the edge of one frame and feels the emotional weight of unfinished conversations, the unspoken words that never found a safe moment. Some pictures still smell like summer, others smell like hospital sanitizer in his imagination, and he hates how the mind connects dots without permission. He whispers a name under his breath, then stops, embarrassed, like the house might answer back, like the echo might snitch on him. That's the weird thing about grief. It makes a grown man act like a kid afraid of the dark, even when he knows better, even when he's trying. And the silence just watches, patient and cruel, as if it knows he'll eventually sit down and surrender to remembering. He passes the kitchen and the midnight air slips in through a cracked window, carrying that cold bite that always shows up when you're out of time. On the table there's an old ring mark from a glass, and it hits him how a tiny stain can trigger an entire movie behind the eyes. He imagines one last drink, not to drown the pain, but to borrow 5 minutes from eternity, to pretend the impact never happened. He can almost hear a cracked voice laughing at a dumb joke, the kind that wasn't even funny, but was funny because it was them. Longing is a strange hunger, because it doesn't want food, it wants a moment, it wants a normal Tuesday that you didn't appreciate enough. He thinks about blood and how people say, "They're in your blood." And yeah, that's true, but it's also in your routines, in your breathing. And suddenly he hates the chair across from him, because it's empty on purpose now, like the world made a decision without asking. From the outside, neighbors would say the place is calm, maybe even cozy, but inside it's a silent battle between denial and acceptance. He tries to be practical, the way mentors talk about resilience, like, keep moving, clean the house, make coffee, act normal, so he does. But every small task turns into a trapdoor, because memory is everywhere. In the spoon drawer, in the detergent smell, in the crooked rug. Grief doesn't always cry, sometimes it schedules itself, showing up as a heavy chest at 2 a.m. when the deep silence has the loudest voice. He sits, stands, sits again, because his body is temporary but the emotional imprint isn't, and that fact is both comforting and terrifying. He's learning that courage isn't a heroic speech, it's washing a cup that two people used to share, and not breaking it out of anger. And still, fragile reality keeps flickering, like a TV with bad reception, because his mind keeps replaying the moment before the impact. He tells himself, no ghosts, yet he avoids the bedroom doorway like it's guarded by something sharp, something sacred, something he can't face. That room holds the farewell he never rehearsed, the goodbye he didn't believe would come so soon, and the unspoken words that still sting. He thinks people skip the real part when they talk about loss, the ugly part, the part where you bargain with time like time can be bribed. So he does the human thing. He negotiates in his head, offering promises he can't keep, asking for signs, asking for anything that feels like control. He presses his palm to the cold walls and feels stupid for hoping the house will warm up, but hope is stubborn, it won't die quietly. Spiritual strength, he realizes, isn't loud confidence. It's staying in the room long enough to feel the pain without running back to distractions. And that's when he notices his hands aren't just trembling from cold, they're trembling because he's finally getting close to the truth. He walks back to the living room, and the Museum of Memories looks different now, less like decoration and more like evidence in a case. Each photo says, this was real, and each empty space says, this is real too, because absence has its own fingerprints. He remembers how they used to talk about forever, about eternity, like it was a place they'd visit together someday, like a vacation they deserved. Now eternity feels like a hallway he can't see the end of, and he's stuck at the entrance with a key that doesn't fit any door. He laughs once, soft, almost guilty, because it's funny how life can be generous and savage in the same week, like it can't pick a mood. Then the laughter collapses into slow breathing again, and he understands, the eternal bond doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. And that shape, this invisible presence, fills the house even when the rooms are quiet, even when he swears there are no ghosts. He finally sits beneath the frames and lets the silence speak, because fighting it only makes it louder, and he's tired of performing strength. Canso of thinking, he admits it. He wants that last drink not because he's weak, but because he loved deeply and love leaves a mark. He whispers, I'm trying, like the person could hear him, and maybe they can, or maybe it's just memory doing what memory does. Still, the impact is right there behind his eyes, waiting, and he knows the story can't stay in this room forever, it has to go back to that day. Because this empty house didn't become a museum overnight, it became one the moment the phone rang, the moment the world shifted into goodbye. He looks at the door as if it's a timeline, and he feels that inner war gearing up, like the next step will cost him everything emotionally. So he breathes, steadies his trembling hands, and prepares to open the memory of the day the impact arrived, because that's where the real fight begins. The phone didn't ring loudly that afternoon, but somehow the sound cut through the house like a blade, sharp and precise, the kind of sound that divides your life into before and after without asking permission. He remembers staring at the screen for a second too long, like fragile reality might glitch and correct itself if he just waited. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind that makes your heartbeat feel louder than the ringtone itself. He almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail, because deep down something in his blood already knew. When he finally pressed accept, his trembling hands felt disconnected from his body, like they belonged to someone else. The voice on the other side wasn't cracked yet, but it carried that professional calm that never brings good news. And in that first silent pause, before any words were spoken, the impact had already begun. They say time slows down during trauma, and he used to think that was dramatic exaggeration, but in that moment every second stretched like eternity on a thin wire. The words came out carefully. Accident, critical, we're doing everything we can, and each syllable felt like a hammer tapping against his ribs. His heavy chest refused to breathe properly, like oxygen itself had stepped back out of respect. He asked questions he doesn't even remember forming, unfinished conversations already flashing through his mind like broken slides. Somewhere in the background, a clock ticked, and he hated it, hated that normal things kept functioning. Reality doesn't shatter with noise, sometimes it collapses in complete silence. And as he hung up, the empty house already felt different, already aware of what was coming. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and inner war, of bargaining and denial, of whispering promises to a sky he wasn't sure was listening. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, blood rushing in his ears like a drum he couldn't silence. Be strong, he told himself, But courage felt theoretical when absence was hovering that close. Every street looked unfamiliar, like the world had subtly rearranged itself without his consent. He kept replaying the last normal conversation they had, searching for hidden meaning, searching for signs he missed. That's the cruel part about impact. It makes you review ordinary moments like they were coded messages. And by the time he reached the hospital entrance, he already felt older than he had that morning. The hospital hallway smelled sterile, too clean, like grief wasn't allowed to stain the floors. Dim light flickered overhead, and he hated how cinematic everything felt, like he was trapped inside a scene he didn't audition for. A nurse spoke gently, guiding him, but her voice sounded distant, like an echo traveling through water. He noticed ridiculous details, a crooked sign, a vending machine humming, because the brain grabs onto small things to survive big pain. When he saw the room number, his heartbeat turned violent, pounding against his ribs like it wanted out. He paused at the door, trembling hands hovering inches from the handle, knowing life would never return to its previous shape. And in that suspended second, fragile reality cracked completely. Inside the room, machines beeped with mechanical indifference, and that's when he understood how temporary the body truly is. The person lying there looked familiar and distant at the same time, like a version paused mid-sentence. He whispered their name, softly at first, then again with a cracked voice, because silence suddenly felt unbearable. He talked about ordinary things, the house, the photos, the weather, as if normalcy could negotiate with fate. Spiritual strength felt thin, like paper trying to hold back a flood. He promised things he didn't know how to fulfill, legacy plans, future trips, one last drink when all this was over. And somewhere between hope and denial, eternity shifted direction. When the doctor came back, he already knew, even before the words formed. There's a specific tone professionals use when impact becomes irreversible, a softness that feels like surrender. The sentence wasn't long, but it carried the weight of goodbye inside it. He didn't scream, didn't collapse. Grief can be strangely quiet in its first appearance. Instead, he felt deep silence wrap around him, thick and suffocating, like the world had muted itself. Acceptance wasn't there yet, only absence, sharp and immediate. And in that absence, he felt something inside him break without making a sound. He doesn't remember the ride back home, only fragments, streetlights, reflections on the windshield, the echo of hospital words. When he opened the door to the empty house, the Museum of Memories didn't look nostalgic anymore, it looked permanent. The dusty frames no longer celebrated moments, they documented them. The kitchen chair across the table had officially become sacred ground. He stood in the middle of the living room, heavy chest rising and falling, realizing goodbye had entered the air. This was the moment the house stopped being a place and started being a container of eternity. And even though the impact had landed, he had no idea that the hardest battle was still ahead, the night he would crave one last drink more than anything. That first night back home, he didn't sleep like a normal person sleeps, he just drifted in and out of memory, trapped between silence and echo. The empty house felt bigger and smaller at the same time, like absence had expanded the rooms while shrinking his lungs. He kept hearing the hospital beeps in his head, that mechanical reminder that the body is temporary, no matter how much love is eternal. He tried to be strong, like people always say, but strength sounded like a slogan when his chest felt heavy enough to sink. Around 2 a.m., he stood in the kitchen under dim light, staring at the counter like it owed him an answer. His trembling hands reached for a glass, not because he wanted to escape, but because he wanted a ritual, a bridge. And that's when the idea hit him, one last drink, not as weakness, but as a conversation with goodbye. He remembered how they used to sit at that table after long days, talking about nothing and everything, laughing at jokes that weren't even good. The best moments aren't the glamorous ones, he realized. They're the small ordinary scenes that become priceless only after impact. He poured the drink slowly, listening to the liquid as if it carried a voice, as if the sound could summon an invisible presence. The glass left a ring on the wood, and he stared at it like it was a signature from the past, a mark of blood and belonging. He set a second glass on the other side of the table, and even doing that felt like an inner war against fragile reality. Because part of him knew nobody would pick it up, but another part of him refused to accept that as the final truth. In grief, people don't just miss someone, they miss the version of themselves that existed when that person was still here. He tried to talk out loud, softly at first, then with a cracked voice that surprised him, like his throat had been holding back a scream for hours. He said the things most people skip, the embarrassing truths: I don't know how to do this, I'm scared, I'm mad, I'm sorry. Unfinished conversations don't disappear when someone leaves, they multiply, they echo in your head at the worst times. He confessed tiny regrets, like not hugging long enough, not listening fully, not realizing a normal Tuesday could be a treasure. That's the part nobody posts on social media. The guilt is quiet, and it doesn't care if you're a good person. He raised his glass toward the empty chair and whispered, "Just one last drink, that's all I'm asking." And for a second, the silence almost felt softer, like it leaned in to listen. He took a slow sip and expected warmth, but what he felt was memory expanding, flooding his senses with images he didn't invite. A laugh in the hallway, footsteps on the stairs, the smell of their shampoo, the way their eyes looked when they were about to tease him. It was like the museum of memories came alive, not with ghosts, but with emotional weight that had been stored in the walls. He realized then why people say grief comes in waves, because it pulls you under, then lets you breathe, then drags you again. He wanted to be courageous, to look death straight and honored, but courage doesn't cancel pain, it just gives it a place to sit. He thought of the vultures in the sky from the song's imagery, those signs that warn you something is ending, and he hated how accurate it felt. Yet even in that hate, he felt a strange acceptance starting to form, like a seed in dark soil. A thought came to him, the kind that sounds too simple until you live it. When you lose someone, you don't only lose them, you lose your future plans. That's why the absence hurts like a physical thing, because it steals moments that haven't happened yet. He looked at the second glass and imagined them saying, half smiling, "Don't make it weird," because they always knew how to break tension. And he almost laughed, a real laugh, because humor is sometimes the only spiritual strength that keeps you from collapsing. He remembered a mentor once saying, "Pain demands to be felt, but it doesn't deserve to own you," and that line finally made sense. So he let the tears come without shame, because pretending you're fine is exhausting, and he was Kansuo of performing. Then he wiped his face, staring at the glass like it was a contract with eternity. He didn't want to romanticize the drink, because he knew people can use anything as a hiding place, and he refused to hide from reality. This wasn't about escaping, it was about honoring, about legacy, about turning a moment into something sacred instead of just tragic. He spoke again, calmer now, like a mentor talking to a friend. "If you're watching this, remember, tell people what you feel while they're still here. Because unspoken words become chains, and chains get heavier with time, and nobody deserves to drag that weight alone." He promised himself small practical things. Keep the photos clean, keep the stories alive, visit the places they loved, share the lessons. He realized that memory isn't meant to torture you, it's meant to teach you what mattered, so you can live differently. And that's when he understood the last drink wasn't the end of the night, it was the beginning of a new fight. He left the second glass untouched, not as denial, but as a symbol, like a candle you light to say, "I still carry you in my blood." Then he walked through the house again, slower this time, noticing how the deep silence wasn't as sharp as it had been earlier. Fragile reality hadn't healed, not even close, but it felt less like a prison and more like a road he could actually walk. He stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker, wondering how so many people can sleep while someone else's world is burning. He whispered, "I'm still trying," and it wasn't dramatic, it was honest, the only kind of courage that counts. Because now he knew the real battle wasn't just missing them, it was learning to look death in the eye without losing his soul. And tomorrow, when the sun rose, he'd have to face the next stage, the war inside him that would test whether grief would break him or build him. The morning after the last drink didn't feel heroic, it felt ordinary in the most brutal way, because the sun still rose as if nothing had happened. Light spilled through the curtains and touched the dusty frames, and for a second he felt betrayed by how beautiful the world looked. That's the strange thing about grief, it doesn't pause the universe, it only rewrites your private map of it. He stood there with slow breathing, heavy chest still present, realizing the silent battle wasn't about tears anymore. It was about waking up and choosing not to collapse under the emotional weight of absence. Courage, he understood now, isn't loud or cinematic, it's brushing your teeth when you don't feel like having a future. And that's when the real inner war began, not against memory, but against surrender. He used to think looking death in the eye meant standing at a hospital bed or hearing a final goodbye. But now he realized the harder part was looking at life again without resentment. Because death doesn't just take someone, it challenges your faith in meaning, in fairness, in eternity itself. He would catch himself thinking, "What's the point?" And that question felt more dangerous than tears. Acceptance isn't passive. It's an active decision to continue breathing even when breathing feels unfair. He remembered the phrase from the song, to face death straight and honored, and it echoed in his mind. Facing it honored meant not letting it steal his humanity. There were moments when fragile reality tried to bend again, especially in quiet afternoons when the house felt too still. Deep silence can be healing, but it can also be a battlefield where your thoughts turn against you. He'd sit at the table, staring at the untouched second glass, feeling the pull of old habits, retreat, numb, avoid. But spiritual strength, he was learning, doesn't grow in avoidance, it grows in exposure. So instead of running from the museum of memories, he started walking through it intentionally. He'd pick up a frame, tell the story out loud, laugh where laughter belonged, cry where crying was honest. Because memory, when faced head-on, transforms from enemy into teacher. One afternoon, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Grief had carved subtle lines into his face, the kind that don't show up in photographs but feel permanent. He placed his hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat steady, and that simple rhythm became symbolic. The body is temporary, yes, but as long as it beats, you still have work to do. Legacy isn't just what the one who left behind created, it's what the one who stays decides to build. That realization didn't erase absence, but it shifted the weight slightly, like adjusting a heavy backpack. And for the first time, the inner war felt less chaotic and more strategic. He began doing small things differently, almost experimentally, like someone testing a theory about resilience. He'd cook a meal they loved, not to torture himself, but to keep the bond alive in a practical way. He'd walk the same streets they walked, feeling the midnight air against his skin, whispering gratitude instead of goodbye. He started journaling unfinished conversations, turning unspoken words into ink instead of regret. Because if memory stays trapped inside, it corrodes, but if you release it, it breathes. That's a lesson most people learn too late. Silence is powerful, but expression is freeing. And slowly, courage stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like growth. There were setbacks, of course, nights when the impact replayed with full force and he felt Kansuo of pretending progress. Grief isn't linear, it loops back like an echo that refuses to fade. He'd wake up sweating, heart racing, convinced he had heard a voice in the hallway. But instead of panicking, he would sit with it, acknowledging the invisible presence without letting it control him. He'd say out loud, "I miss you," as if naming the pain reduced its sharpness. That honesty became his armor, not denial, not distraction, just truth. And strangely enough, truth made the silence softer. By the end of that week, something subtle had changed in the empty house. It wasn't lighter, not yet, but it felt less hostile, less like a trap and more like a sacred space. He realized death had entered his story, but it didn't get to write the ending. The eternal bond wasn't broken, it had simply shifted dimensions, from physical to spiritual. Facing death straight and honored meant continuing the story with integrity. And as he looked again at the walls filled with dusty frames, he felt a new urge rising inside him. Because if this was truly a museum of memories, then maybe it was time to understand what those memories were trying to teach him next. He used to think the Museum of Memories was just a poetic way to describe his walls, but now he understood it was something much deeper. Every dusty frame wasn't decoration, it was evidence that love once lived loudly inside this empty house. The silence still existed, yes, but it no longer felt like an enemy, it felt like a curator. Curating the echoes, preserving the laughter, protecting the fragile reality that once seemed so solid. He began walking through the rooms differently, slower, as if he were guiding a visitor through a sacred exhibition. "This is where we used to argue about nothing," he'd whisper with a half-smile. "And this is where we learned what really mattered." Memory changed texture when he stopped resisting it. Instead of stabbing him with absence, it began teaching him about legacy. He noticed how certain photos held more emotional weight than others, not the glamorous ones, but the ordinary Tuesdays. A random coffee morning, a blurry selfie, a lazy Sunday on the couch. That's the thing about eternity, it hides inside small, forgettable days. He realized most people chase trophies and miss the museum they're building every single day. And suddenly, regret turned into awareness. He started dusting the frames intentionally, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Each swipe of the cloth felt symbolic, like he was clearing space inside his heavy chest. Spiritual strength, he was learning, grows in simple rituals. He began telling stories about each picture, even when no one was there to listen. Because unfinished conversations don't disappear, they evolve into lessons. He would say, "You taught me patience here," or "You showed me courage there." And speaking it out loud made the invisible presence feel warm instead of sharp. There were moments when grief still surged unexpectedly, like a wave slamming into his inner war without warning. But instead of drowning, he'd let it wash through him, understanding that emotional release is not weakness. Acceptance doesn't mean the absence of pain, it means the absence of resistance. He would sit beneath the frames, close his eyes, and let the echo replay naturally. Sometimes he laughed at jokes he hadn't remembered in months. Sometimes he cried quietly, without drama, just honest tears. And every time he stood back up, the silence felt less suffocating. He realized something powerful one afternoon while looking at a photo taken on a completely ordinary day. In that picture, they weren't celebrating anything. No holiday, no milestone, just life happening. And yet, that ordinary moment now felt eternal. That's when it hit him. Eternity isn't a future place, it's a present experience remembered deeply. The body is temporary, but shared presence leaves permanent imprints. The museum wasn't about what he lost, it was about what he was given. And that shift changed the entire emotional architecture of the house. Instead of avoiding the bedroom, he walked in deliberately one evening. The air still carried that deep silence, but it no longer felt hostile. He sat on the edge of the bed and spoke calmly, like a mentor explaining life to a friend. "Love doesn't disappear when the body does," he said, steady and grounded. "It transforms into responsibility. Responsibility to live well, to carry the legacy forward, to honor the bond without collapsing under it." And that thought felt like solid ground beneath fragile reality. As days passed, the museum stopped being a shrine to goodbye and started becoming a map forward. He noticed that every memory carried instruction, not just nostalgia. Patience, gratitude, forgiveness, humor in hard times. The eternal bond wasn't asking him to freeze in grief, it was asking him to continue. And in that continuation, he felt something new emerging, not closure, but purpose. But purpose brings its own questions, the kind that surface late at night. Because eventually, he would have to confront something even harder than memory, the reality that one day, he too would have to say goodbye. It took him longer than he expected to understand that, "Forgive me, I have to go," wasn't just something said by the one who left. At first, he thought it belonged only to hospital rooms and final breaths, to cracked voices fading into deep silence. But as days stretched into weeks, he realized something unsettling. One day, he too would have to say those words. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually, because the body is temporary for everyone. That awareness didn't scare him at first, it humbled him. Fragile reality became clearer, sharper, almost honest in a way it hadn't been before. And suddenly, eternity didn't feel distant, it felt inevitable. He started noticing how people avoid talking about death as if silence can delay it. Friends would say, "Stay strong," or "Time heals," but nobody wanted to sit in the uncomfortable truth. That inner war people fight isn't really against loss, it's against their own mortality. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what his own museum of memories would look like someday. Would it be filled with unfinished conversations? Would someone sit in his empty house and whisper his name into absence? And that question shifted everything. The impact of that realization was quieter than the hospital call, but deeper. It wasn't explosive grief, it was existential clarity. He understood that legacy isn't built in grand gestures, it's shaped in daily choices. In patience when you're tired. In honesty when it's easier to lie. In love expressed before it becomes regret. And that understanding made him want to live differently. One evening, sitting under the dim light with slow breathing and steady heartbeat, he imagined his own farewell. Not dramatically, not tragically, just realistically. He imagined saying, "Forgive me, I have to go," with dignity instead of fear. He imagined wanting to leave behind strength, not emotional chaos. He realized the only way to prepare for that moment is to live fully now. To close unfinished conversations. To speak unspoken words before they turn into chains. He picked up one of the dusty frames again, this time not with trembling hands, but with intention. He said out loud, "You taught me how fragile time is." And in that acknowledgement, the invisible presence felt less like pain and more like guidance. Acceptance doesn't erase longing, but it transforms longing into motivation. He began reaching out to people more often, calling instead of texting, listening instead of waiting for his turn to speak. The empty house still held silence, but now it felt like sacred ground instead of emotional confinement. He understood that deep silence isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to reflect. Space to grow. Space to choose who you want to be before your own final night arrives. And that perspective gave him a new kind of courage. Not loud courage, grounded courage. Because one day, whether ready or not, everyone whispers some version of goodbye. The real question isn't when, it's how. How do you want to be remembered in someone else's museum of memories? With regret? With love? With unfinished echoes? He stood in the center of the living room, looking at the walls differently now. The eternal bond didn't just connect him to the one who left, it connected him to his own responsibility. And that realization prepared him for the final transformation still waiting, the moment when silence would no longer hurt at all. There comes a moment in grief that doesn't announce itself, it doesn't ring like the phone did that day, it just arrives quietly. He noticed it one afternoon when he walked into the empty house and didn't feel the usual punch in his chest. The silence was still there, deep and steady, but it no longer felt like an enemy pressing against his ribs. It felt like presence without pressure. Like memory without accusation. Like absence without violence. And that subtle shift changed everything. The Museum of Memories hadn't lost its emotional weight, but it had transformed. Dusty frames still lined the walls, yet they no longer looked like evidence of loss. They looked like proof of love. The echo of laughter didn't sting, it warmed. The invisible presence didn't haunt, it guided. He realized grief had completed its loudest phase. And what remained was something quieter and stronger. He could now sit at the kitchen table without staring at the second glass like it was a wound. The idea of one last drink no longer carried desperation, it carried gratitude. He understood that the real last drink had already happened, it was every shared moment he once took for granted. Fragile reality had stabilized into acceptance. Not perfect acceptance, not permanent peace, but grounded clarity. He had faced death straight and honored, just like the song suggested. And in doing so, he hadn't lost himself. There were still nights when longing returned unexpectedly, because love doesn't disappear when the body does. But longing no longer felt like drowning, it felt like remembering. The inner war had settled into reflection. The heavy chest had softened into steady breathing. He could whisper their name without breaking. He could look at the sky without anger. And that was progress no one else could measure but him. He began living more intentionally, almost experimentally at first. Calling people just to say, "I appreciate you." Sitting longer at dinners instead of rushing. Choosing honesty over pride. Choosing presence over distraction. Because the impact had taught him something most people only learn when it's too late. Eternity hides in ordinary minutes. One evening, standing by the window with the midnight air brushing his face, he felt something close to peace. Not the naive peace of forgetting, but the mature peace of integration. The eternal bond didn't feel distant anymore. It felt internal. Like blood memory flowing quietly through his veins. Like strength inherited instead of borrowed. And as he walked through the house one last time that night, he understood something clearly. The silence had stopped hurting because he had stopped fighting it. Acceptance had replaced resistance. Legacy had replaced regret. Love had replaced fear. The house no longer held ghosts, it held continuity. And in that continuity, he knew the story wasn't ending. It was evolving beyond what he could see. If this story stayed with you, don't ignore that feeling. Grief is universal, but reflection is a choice. Tell me in the comments, what part hit you the hardest? Was it the phone call? The last drink? Or the moment when silence stopped hurting? Have you ever walked through your own house and felt memory echoing in the walls? Have you ever left words unspoken, thinking you'd have more time? What would your museum of memories look like if someone walked through it today? Would it be filled with regret, or with gratitude? Be honest, I really want to know. And now I want to ask you something powerful. What song should we turn into a story next? Drop the title in the comments. Maybe your favorite song holds a story no one has told the right way yet. Maybe your suggestion becomes the next emotional journey on this channel. If this kind of storytelling moved you, if it made you think deeper, breathe slower, feel stronger, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, we don't just listen to music. We transform it into experience, into reflection, into something that stays with you long after the video ends.